welcome. Yes. Welcome everyone to the Connecticut Veterans Legal Center's next webinar in our Honor and Identity series, focusing on gender in the military. My name is Chelsea Donaldson, and I am an attorney at the Connecticut Veterans Legal Center, and I'm going to be moderating this discussion with these amazing panelists that have given time to us today to discuss such an important topic. I wanted to start with just a brief explanation of what Cvlc does. The Connecticut Veterans Legal Center, which is co-founded by Howard Udell, is the nation's first medical legal partnership with VA. And we really focus on breaking down the barriers to housing, income, and healthcare for our indigent clients, with a real focus on mental health and folks that are struggling with mental illness as a result of their time in the service. And one of the reasons why I am just so excited that Cvlc decided to pick this as the next chapter in our Honor and Identity series is because most of the work that I do at Cvlc revolves around representing folks who are really struggling with trauma that they've experienced in the service. I want to say about 85% of my caseload are folks who have experienced military sexual trauma. And one thing that has always struck me when I talk to my clients is I always ask them at the end of an affidavit, you know, if you could sum up your military experience in one sentence or two sentences, the different answers that I get based on gender identity and sexual orientation are so radically different from one another. My cisgender male veterans have very different answers to the question of how would you sum up your military service in comparison to my cisgender female clients or my trans clients or women of color. And that difference in experience is what I hope we highlight today. And I know that our amazing panelists are going to do exactly that, in hopefully opening the door to a really important conversation about veteran experience, the difference in experience based on your gender identity and other intersectionalities in your expression, and just really kind of giving us some good footnotes on where can we go from here and what can we do to help make this experience in serving in the service more equitable for everybody involved. So enough about me and what I think. You're all here to listen to our amazing panelists. And I wanted to start with just reading some brief bios, and then we're just going to jump right into it. So first and foremost, I'd like to introduce Lindsay Church. Lindsay Church is the executive director and co-founder of Minority Veterans of America and has nearly a decade of experience rooted in veterans advocacy and grassroots organizing. They have facilitated agency-wide cultural competency trainings and assessments to ensure organizations and governmental entities are able to serve their minority and veteran constituencies effectively and efficiently. Their previous appointments include LGBTQ Commissioner for the City of Seattle, co-chair of Congresswoman Suzanne Delbin, Veterans Advisory Council, and they have participated in Armed Forces Academy selection for Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. Lindsay is a veteran of the United States Navy, where they served as a cryptologic technician interpretive. And then up next on our panel is Pam Compost Palma. Pam Compost Palma is the Director of Peace and Security for the Working Families Party, where she runs Vets for the People, a movement of veterans and military voters dedicated to justice, transformative change, and building a nation for the many, not the few. She served in the United States Air Force for over a decade as an intelligence analyst specializing in geopolitical analysis, anti-counterterrorism, force protection, and aircrew security operations with duty in Germany, Kyrgyzstan, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Pam has been recognized internationally for her transformative leadership, served as a gubernatorial appointee in the state of Oregon, and addresses issues of civil resistance, equity, justice, and building a new vision and practice of human-centered foreign policy and national security. And last but certainly not least is Juliet Taylor. And Juliet is a colleague of mine as the intake coordinator at the Connecticut Veterans Legal Center and a decorated Army veteran who served for over 11 years, including deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. She has extensive experience as a veterans advocate, having worked tirelessly with several veteran and community organizations across Connecticut, rising to Senior Vice Commander of the Disabled American Veterans Department of Connecticut. So now that I've introduced these amazing folks that are going to talk about this important topic and the work that they do, I would love to hand over the conversation to Lindsay to kick us off, and take it away, Lindsay.
Thank you for having me. And I don't know about you all, but I'm so awkward when somebody reads my bio. So thank you for that. And thank you for the introduction and for having me and in this conversation. I know there were some questions. I don't know if you want to just dive into some of the thoughts that I had around the idea of gender in the military or gender in the veteran community. Just want to kind of make sure that I'm doing this right.
No worries. I'm also super awkward when people read my bio. But yeah, so don't worry about that. I think a lot of people just have varying levels of comfort about hearing about their resume. So totally get that. I can start off with a question if that makes you more comfortable. I can totally
Absolutely
do that. All right, perfect. So, muting myself already. This is off to a great
start. I thought for sure it was me. I was like,
no, it was me. So as an advocate and as a veteran yourself, how have you seen the gendered expectations of military service interact with personal identity?
Thank you for that. So I think starting off there, I believe that frameworks help us understand. And I think part of the military is understanding that the uniform of the military is not what you put on, it's the identity that you're expected to assume. So your uniform is one thing, and they'll tell you that we all bleed green, but really what that means is that we are all assuming the identity of a straight white Christian male, and everything else that falls outside of that identity makes us different and makes us targets. So when you look at the idea of the uniform, gender is something that sticks out. So if you don't identify as male or cisgender male, you stand out. And you're subject to discrimination. You're subject to othering at best, but discrimination at worst. I know for myself, I identify now as non-binary, but when I served as a lesbian under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and I looked very much like this. I was very resistant to growing my hair out and doing all the things that were expected of me to be a woman in the military at the time. And so I had many instances of harassment or discrimination just because of the way that I looked. The good experiences were like my superiors telling me that, Church, you're a good sailor and you're going to be great at doing this. But and we know about people like you in talking about my LGBTQ identity. And so I was told then that if I wanted to be a good service member, that I would need to find a boyfriend that was gay to be able to kind of hide my LGBTQ identity, and that I needed to grow my hair out. And part of me didn't understand why growing my hair out was so integral to my success as a service member. It really didn't make me any different, but it did open me to instances of discrimination. There were times in training when I was just trying to leave the building, but you have the fake quarter deck that I was not allowed to pass through because my hair was quote unquote fattish, which just meant that your hair didn't fit within the regulations of what they expected for you as a woman. And this was, common knowledge, excuse my language, but, I would hear people down the hall as I was walking by that were saying that dyke doesn't belong in my military. Like, these were instances of regular discrimination that was completely acceptable. I mean, these were things that were happening from an E6 and E7 and E8 with an open door. So the idea of Don't Ask, Don't Tell was really just, you don't get to tell. I'm going to ask you, or I'm going to say inappropriate things. And this is going to be the framework for your service, and you're going to tolerate it because you're serving under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and that expects you to hold to not telling. And, even in the instances of like what women were understood to be, they were understood to be three things. And I think you all are going to know exactly what I'm talking about, is that you were expected to be a mattress, a lesbian, or a word that I won't use. Those were the things that women were expected to be in the military. And if you were somebody that just didn't go along to get along, you were an outcast and you were subject to discrimination on a regular basis. And something to really understand here is that when we talk about gender, it's almost always assumed to be women and cisgender women. But when you look at the idea of trans folks and non-binary folks, gender very much informs that framework. We talk a lot about don't ask, don't tell, but many people don't ever mention the fact that trans folks were never covered by don't ask, don't tell, that it was always an outright ban. And that even in 2016, when they opened the doors and said, yes, we're going to accept trans service members because trans service members belong here, they closed that door again. And so that discrimination is ripe, it's fresh. The policy was just overturned in 2021. In service, there were trans folks that I knew that were out, working, getting hormones in town in 2010 and not probably safely. And this was a part of their identity and the things that they had to do to just insert dignity into their lives. And so gender very much is a framework for understanding how, service members exist in the world. And then, add layers of intersectionality, and you're looking at women of color, you're looking at people of color that are trans and non-binary, and those experiences get progressively worse. And the outcomes for those folks get progressively worse on the systems level. The individual level, we can talk all day long about our instances of discrimination, but when you talk to other people and those instances of discrimination are a threat to all of our service, we have a problem.
Yeah, I think that I'm glad that you brought up the issue of trans folks in the service, because I do think that population definitely gets left out of the conversation, especially like you said, trans folks were never protected or they've always been excluded, even with their revocation of don't ask, don't tell. And it is definitely a fresh wound. And I think we can't really have a discussion about gender in the service without being inclusive of those trans folks that are still experiencing violence, quite frankly, in the service and in civilian life today. I kind of wanted to circle back and ask kind of the same question, but post-military life. Like, how do you feel that your identity, Lindsay, post-service has kind of shaped your experience in the veteran community once you discharged and were outside of active duty?
So the interesting thing about being post-service is that people expect once you get out of the service, your experience will be better or different, and that you'll go into these veteran communities and things will just be, you'll be accepted and, they'll celebrate you. And that's absolutely not the reality. I think the veteran community very much reflects the military community. I mean, those ideas don't just go away when you take the uniform off. You don't just change your mind, and those folks that haven't been pushed to change the community in 100 years are not willingly just going to give over the keys to the castle and let us be the leadership that they see. And so prior to starting Minority Vets, I worked in the student veteran space, and I was the commander of an American Legion. My first night as commander, I was told it was okay that I was gay, but I didn't need to talk about my wife. And this was like day one. And so that was my experience. You can lead this post, we'll take from you. You can do all the things that we tell you to do, but you can't talk about the things that are most authentic to who you are as a human being. And that was just my experience. But at the same time, here I was trying to revive an American Legion post that had like 60 members, doubled a membership in a year, but every single person that I brought in that was a minority was harassed. Women were asked right out the gate when they first got there if they had a boyfriend, if they had a husband, if they wanted to go on a date, who they were dating, really invasive questions from very old men, very inappropriately asked and very inappropriately framed. And how can I build a veteran community around that? And so for me, I existed in that space until about 2017 was when we started. Right after the trans ban was announced, it was about 2 weeks after. And that, changed everything about it. It was, 2017 was, I think, a formative year for a lot of organizers in the vet space, especially minorities taking the helm and really, kind of saying enough is enough. We deserve a better community here. And so my experiences in the veteran community were very similar to my experiences in the military. But the difference is that I wasn't willing to take it forever. In the military, you're expected because of good order and discipline to continue on and go along to get along. But when in the military, in the veteran community, I don't owe anybody that. My experience is my experience. And if this community is going to be toxic to people like me, I won't continue to do this. I will build a better community for all of us, because this is like, people shouldn't have to endure toxic masculinity and all of the spaces that exist. Like, this is voluntary. I don't have to be here. So for me, like, my experience as a queer non-binary person, like, was very much shaped by my veteran identity. And I didn't want to be a part of the same community, which also at the same time limits your resources. It limits the amount of, like, those resources are meant to help you. They're meant to help you get mental health resources, to help you get your claims filed, to help you walk through all of the terrible, hard things to navigate that veterans endure. They're supposed to be there to help you. But when you can't trust them, when you can't expect that you're not going to be marginalized or traumatized in those spaces, where do you go to exist? Like, we see all these problems within the community, and we see like these outcomes, these major health outcomes, these major life outcomes, and they're deeply impacted by whether or not you have the ability to get to seek services and help for those things that you need most.
Yeah, and I also think that it's worth noting that folks who fall into these categories of a minority or more marginalized people, right? LGBTQ folks, people of color, trans folks are way more likely to experience trauma in the service, and way more likely to experience military sexual trauma in particular. And so when you have this perfect storm, like you're describing, Lindsay, of you have these people getting out of the service and they really need help, so they go to these organizations for assistance. Why would you confide in somebody that this awful thing happened to you if it's not a safe space for you to do so? So I take it, leading all into this is how you created Minority Veterans. And we're gonna circle back at the end of the presentation for a bit of a call to action, but I would love to have just a brief explanation about Minority Vets and the work that you do, and how you've really kind of helped pioneer this space for folks who really need this outlet and this community that you're talking about, for folks that may not fit in as neatly into American Legion or those other spaces.
Yeah, so I guess talking about in 2017 was a formative year for myself and many organizers that I met, and Pam, I met you in 2017, so about the same time. And we were experiencing, both in the student veteran space, which is supposed to be better for us and younger, and they have better, like, more open mindsets, which is absolutely not true. And so one of my best friends is a Korean American woman veteran, and she's one of the coolest people I know. And between the two of us, like, I'm an LGBTQ person. I identify as queer, non-binary. I will never understand what it feels like to live as a person of color in this country. Catherine Pratt will never understand what it feels like to be a queer, non-binary person in this country. But the one thing that we always understood was that oppression, like what it feels like to be oppressed in this community. And I had seen so many movements that were one minority identity only. Like, they were, looking at LGBTQ veteran communities, there's only 1 million LGBTQ veterans out there. That makes 5% of the community. Women veterans are 2 million. Racial ethnic minorities are 5.5 million. All of these are really small communities. And without the ability to create an intersectional movement where we can create a powerful voice and get that collective action, they continue to just forget that we exist. And so the impetus for starting the organization was really to push the needle on as many things as we possibly could and get as loud as we possibly could so that they couldn't ignore us. 4.5 years later, we have 2,500 members in 49 states. If you are in Vermont and you are a minority veteran, you should join the organization so that we have all 50 states covered. But we've created this really amazing, powerful movement that has moved the needle on a lot of policy things, but also not just talking. Like, we also do programs. Like, everything that we talk about in the policy space is also direct service that we provide to the community, because I've seen so many people speak for the community but not to the community, or speak to the community not raising policy issues. And really, if we're going to continue to experience these things, we have to program to the ground and make sure that those resources are in the community, while we also work on that systemic change that takes years and decades. So we do a lot of policy work. We do a lot of programs work. We do a lot to really just try to have as many direct engagements in the community as we possibly can, because we need to mobilize. Like, we saw what happened in the last few years where our rights were completely obliterated, and we won't survive another round of that. So for us, it's a collective action movement to really harness the power of people to create that change that we absolutely and critically need now.
You heard it here first, folks. If you are a minority veteran in Vermont, you have an obligation to join Lindsay's amazing organization to round out that 50 states. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for that discussion and that explanation of the work, the crucial and life-saving work that you do. It's so appreciated. We're going to shift gears to talk a bit to Pam about, and I think I'm just going to start off with the same question, Pam, to you, because your experience is a bit different. And I wanted to ask, to give us and our viewers an idea of how your personal experience in the military was like, and how do you feel that your gender identity and expression influenced that experience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a big question.
It's a good question. And it's frankly a question that we need to ask more military members and veterans, because to me, what has been consistently a fascinating thread that has kept me in this work is how much in this country in particular, we love and have a culture of valorizing and lionizing military members and, defenders of whatever. But actually, when it comes to engaging military veterans, particularly those that are outside of the mainstream thinking, like Lindsay mentioned, right? Those that are not the cookie cutter, cis, straight, like also hyper masculine, almost hyper nationalistic, right? Who special forces, which if you think about it, that segment of the population is so small in the actuality to actually the broader ecosystem and pool of people who at this moment in time have ever had a connective tissue to the military and to the Department of Defense of the United States. So, I grew up working class in Boston, Massachusetts. My mom is an immigrant from Honduras, and I'm someone that enlisted in the military after 9/11. So I enlisted in 2006. And I think I entered in a time and in an era where there was this like hyper patriotism, right? Like it was after 9/11. And in my adulthood now, I've been able to see that my pathway into the military was a school to military pipeline kid. I needed money for college, right? I needed the healthcare and the security. But also it was my mom that encouraged me to join the military. And it's important to remember that Latinas are the fastest growing enlisted demographic in all of the services, and particularly in the Marine Corps. And there's a reason for that. And my assessment after doing this work for so long is that increasingly there are people like my mother that get a sense that if I sacrifice my child to go into the military, maybe they will not tolerate some of the systemic racism that I have tolerated as an immigrant in this country. There was definitely, when I left, I remember when I left for boot camp, there was this kind of like, this will make you more American. I hope that for you. And what was interesting about my experience is that my fundamentally, even just off the get from boot camp, race, gender, class, and sexual orientation and gender expression was in my face, even in boot camp. My boot camp cohort had a significant number of queer folks and non-binary folks. And this was at a time where there was a lot of whispering about don't ask, don't tell, and you weren't supposed to tell anyone, but obviously like we're around each other. And also part of the ethos was that we're supposed to build community with each other. So how do you build community and belonging in a super hierarchical and, not very democratic place while ignoring other people's humanity and actually disdaining other people's humanity, right? We were all supposed to act like we were all the same. Like Lindsay said, we all put the uniform on. But I immediately started realizing that, as I went to intelligence school, so I'll say that I, chose to go into the intelligence career field because I thought it would give me higher prospects after the military. It was a very difficult career field to go into. And it was a bizarre experience where I was one of few cis women and few folks of color. And no one was being open about being queer, even though I was queer to myself. And it was just a really bizarre experience where I consistently was really anchored in the Air Force core values: integrity first, service before self, excellence in all we do. But every day in my existence, I felt like I was getting a mixed message that was like, but don't be too honest, not too much integrity, not too much excellence, because that's a threat. And also, you're being political, Pam, cut it out. When I was like, this is about my life. So that, you know, for me as a young person, I've reflected a lot about how disorienting that was. And my attitude at the time was to organize. I didn't know what organizing meant, but I was in an active duty unit where I remember just seeing a pattern of, I ended up being in a unit that was taken over by officers that were outright racist, misogynistic. They had unwritten rules about the enlisted women, myself included, and would call us names in secret. And there was even a policy that several of the enlisted women were not allowed to be put up for awards, no matter how much we did. And at the time, I noticed that we were, to put it lightly, like we were eating shit. Like we were doing the hard work. The other thing I have to say is like the military is not a normal workplace, right? Like we were doing intelligence analysis in 2009, right? I was doing back-to-back deployments. So there was also this distortion where like I had to do life-saving work, critical security work, but also I was getting messages that I didn't belong, that I was a liability. I remember thinking, you know, to give folks a perspective of what I did as an intelligence analyst, it was my job to brief high-level commanders. So imagine a queer young Latina in the front of a briefing room, briefing 40 to 50 mostly white men over 60 years old of much higher rank, of education and class. And I had to get them to actually listen to the analysis I was giving them. And what I learned early on in my career was I had to play a fine line between putting on makeup so that they would actually pay attention to me, because my brown skin made them feel like it was very clear that they did not trust the messenger because I was not one of them. And so that kind of, bias really impacted me. And, I testified to Congress a few years ago that I experienced racial, gendered hostilities and violence, including rape, and also saw myself intervening in multiple rapes at a very young age. And what really stayed with me from my military service is, why is this normal? Why is this normal? Because it's not a secret either. It wasn't a secret, right? And so all of these kind of, mixed messages really frustrated me. I wanted to be an officer. I thought that I could make change from the inside if I became an officer. And I remember that one of the questions in my officer board was, if you become an officer of the Air Force, what is the big policy change that you would focus on if you could? And my counterpart said I would focus on fitness and making sure everybody was more physically fit. Cool. My answer was I would focus on eradicating sexual violence in the Air Force, and starting with our unit. Being that we had just had 2 lieutenant colonels that were caught watching porn in the tactics room, I thought that was a great answer. However, I was pulled aside. By a woman lieutenant colonel, and she asked me if I was okay because they were worried I was in duress. And so I came to the conclusion that I could not exist in the military, that I could not exist as my best self, that I was not going to be allowed to do the work that I wanted to do, that I was not going to be allowed to serve. And that is that has continued to really inform my work, is what I feel like is a lie. What I feel like is a national lie we have not confronted, which is that the military wants and actively recruits increasingly underrepresented people, working class people, women and non-binary people, right? Now there's going to be a big rush to all of a sudden say, wait, we do want trans folks, without actually addressing, right, Lindsay, without actually addressing that the systemic and the cultural continues to actively be harmful and injurious to the very people that they are going to be putting on and have continued to put on their, marketing and posters and all of that, right? And so for me, what I said to Congress directly was that this is about accountability. The military as an institution cannot continue, bottom line, to be unaccountable to the people that it has under its, and employ is like a weird word. And this is where I feel like, what's really drawn me and what really drew me around my experience was military injustice and the justice system in general. Because at the end of every kind of injury point that I experienced in my military career, as a woman, as a Latina, as a queer person, as a formerly working class person, and we don't talk about how folks are paid poverty wages in the military, and that impacts what resources they are able to get. And my experience, I'll wrap by saying my experience was that at the end of, at one point in my career, I filed an Inspector General complaint about some of the abuse I saw, about gendered discrimination and racial discrimination at Fort Base, at Joint Base McChord, Dix, which is one of our biggest bases. And what I found was that these systems that are purported inside are there to protect the institution, not the harmed, right? That experience, and I filed this IG complaint while I was deployed. So I didn't have a lot of legal help. I didn't have advice. I just was trying to figure it out. By even trying to advocate for myself, I grew more depressed. The last 10 years of my work has really been interrogating how do we empower the harmed? How do we create more pressure points through storytelling in particular? Because we're also not victims. That's the other thing that I've really been curious about is my experience is that at every turn I faced the injustice right in the face and tried to make it better. And I see that with my colleagues and other military members and veterans, that there's this willingness. The last thing I'll say on this is, regardless of how people enter the military, what I find fascinating is there's something special about military connected people. There's something really special about a fighting kind of spirit. And sometimes folks land on different sides, but my experience has been that even people that revile the military after the injustices and abuses that they may have experienced, there is this desire to change it so that other people will not go through the same harm. And what I fear now is that the harm is growing. The harm is not only unceased, but actually there are real crises of legitimacy even within the institution, within the veteran service, as Lindsay mentioned, right? Like the spillover effect. And frankly, the lack of power sharing, because at the end of the day, what I see standing in the front of this is a lack of wanting to share power and a lack of wanting to share solutions because people feel angsty, I'll say. Angsty that they will lose their positionality because there is a valor economy here, right? If you're the good soldier that doesn't say anything bad about anything, and if you, do the kind of things that are expected of you and just keep, shut up and color, then, that disruption is well rewarded in the military and veteran communities. And it ends with us. I mean, it's just simple as that. So yeah, I'll let you ask another question before I keep going.
Well, I was going to, I think actually you answered the question I was going to ask, but I wanted to circle back to one of the many truths that you just said, which is just the military's inability to hold people accountable for the wrongs committed against the folks that were harmed. And I know that you, with your work with Vets for the People, have worked on a lot of these high profile cases that unfortunately a lot of people know about. Vanessa, well, not unfortunately that we know about them, but unfortunate that these lives were lost and harmed because of the inaction that was taken by the service. People like Vanessa Gillian and Teo, and I know that you've done a lot of work, and I was going to ask, you know, how the military's inability or refusal rather to properly investigate and hold people accountable, like what your experience with that was, and you answered it. With your experience in just trying to do what you're expected when you are harmed, and filing complaints and going to the inspector general and saying that this thing happened to me. And I think something that you said that a lot of people don't realize, Pam, is one, they don't really go anywhere, and two, it's very re-traumatizing for folks that were harmed. At the beginning, I said that the bulk of my casework at Cvlc are military sexual trauma survivors, and I've helped hundreds of MST survivors in their cases, and I have never seen a formal report from the DoD, because nobody reports it, because, as my clients would say, what's the point? It's re-traumatizing and you're not going to get any help anyway. So I think you actually answered the question I was going to ask, but I would love to hear, you know, briefly about your work on Vanessa Gillian's case and Teo Hu's case, and how those two stories, like, why were they so moving to people that may not have understood that this is a reality for a lot of folks in the service, especially when it comes to sexual violence and trauma?
I mean, the military fundamentally operates in a cone of silence. And we're told that it's for national security reasons, et cetera. But it's fascinating to me that an institution that is part of the government, that has all of our information, that has, I mean, the most securitized institution that has so much information about us, is unable, right? And we should just start saying that they're unwilling. They're unwilling because it actually goes against the bottom line, which is, you know, like for me, I fear that the military is increasingly becoming more of a marketing tool, right, than actually fundamentally answering the question, what is the purpose of the military in 2021 and the next 20 years, right? And how are we actually honoring the commitment? And because let's be like, just to go back to it fundamentally, military service, why do we honor it so much? Why is this such an honorable thing, and yet we treat the people inside of it as disposable? As disposable. And what I've seen is that the greatest disposability, similar to greater society, is the abuse and homicide, frankly, of Black, Indigenous, and women of color, right? Missing Indigenous women, missing and killed Black women. This is a society-wide plight that is hyper made real in the military context when there is such a cone of silence. And so what I saw with both the Vanessa Guillen and the Teo cases, where they were actually one of maybe 8 cases at the time. Like there was actually a lot of different cases of women of color that were killed by, you know, a fellow military person. There's been reports of hate crimes at pretty high profile bases, and yet the depreciation of those lives, right? The depreciation of those particular individuals made it so that what I saw was a media, even the defense and military veteran field and media, did not give as much attention to it. I mean, the way that I learned about Vanessa Guillen was through Spanish language media interviewing the mother when she was missing. And there was a lag for English speaking media to finally actually care about this young soldier and care about how she was murdered on a base, right? And there was also this quickness to overlook that she was sexually harassed. What really hurts me, what really is part of the trauma of this work, is that a lot of this is preventable, right? And yet we treat it as hazard duty, right? Teo's case. Teo's case was another one where we clearly saw abuse of power from the highest of the Marine Corps leadership. And yet, a sexual assault survivor being retaliated against for speaking out by being thrown in the brig and kept there under, frankly, human rights violations, just because they were under contract through the military. That was not something that really was on a lot of people's radar. And so our work at Vets for the People, I mean, is pretty simply to bring attention and to make this grassroots energy that creates the pressure in Washington to give a shit, to be honest. Like I don't want to, I say it in that way because, you know, Lindsay and myself and many others, I think for years have been trying to build movements that actually lift up survivors and the oppressed in our own communities as the heroes that we've been waiting for. And so really what we did was just getting people that we know share this experience, right? The other thing that I feel like is an unsaid secret is to date, 99% of the veterans and military members that I meet in the last 10 years, which is many, have experienced some level of institutional violence around gendered lines. And sexual violence lines, I should say. And so to me, it was a no-brainer that we needed to build real campaigning around accountability for not just these two women, but to use their cases to demonstrate the greater systemic issue. And we were successful in that in some ways. What I found in the Fort Hood report, which I feel like the Fort Hood report is one of the most important tools for all of us moving forward. Because one of the things that I found fascinating in it was that they said that their own PR was not prepared enough. And my answer was, if you don't want bad PR, then don't let your particularly enlisted troops be abused, right? And killed and harmed. So, you know, there's lots of lessons learned in it, but the biggest one is that particularly sexual violence survivors, military sexual violence survivors are some of the potentially best organizers, best leaders that we could possibly have if we created more support systems, because this work is traumatic. And the life cycle of a military member who's experienced harm into veteranness, Lindsay hit it on the head. And I think someone asked in the questions, I'll speak for myself and for the folks that I work with, we're not encouraged to go to VSOs. We're not encouraged to go to the VA, right? Like there's this lack of being able to process grief and harm and trauma and do that. And so it's messy work, it's hard work. But at its root, Vets for the People for me is the culmination and the continuation of fundamentally building leadership development for military veterans that want to be part of change, that want to say no more. And also, we have a duty, we have a responsibility, right? To not be used as props. I remember in 2017 when Lindsay and I met, and we are at a tipping point, I would say, where we have a renaissance of new and exciting, diverse and multifaceted leaders in this space that want to take this issue in particular very seriously. And also there's a contention, right? I think, you know, power does not like to be challenged, and we're seeing a wave of, you know, nationalistic veterans that don't want to let go of the patriarchy in our institutions, right? And are trying to say that the injustices, right? The manipulation of what is injustice. And that's my biggest, I think that's the work in front of us, is making sure that the military injustice movement stays focused on the harmed and on the real systemic issues in front of us. So that's what I'll say.
Well, thank you so much for that, I think, very moving, and I'm sure I don't just speak for myself, but very moving description of your work and just the importance to center the people that are harmed in the work that we do, no matter what we do in the veteran space, centering the folks and their stories and what they would like to do with said stories is of the utmost importance. We're going to shift to, last but not least, Juliet, who is going to speak a bit about her experience in the service. And I'm going to start with, you know, the same question that I asked the other panelists, Juliet, which is, can you give us and our viewers an idea of your personal experience in the military and how you feel that your gender expression really influenced that experience while you served?
So something that Pam says and that Lindsay commented on was the word that I felt most of my military, especially the early part of my military career, that I felt like I was a prop. And even though I believe that leaders know of sexism and racism and bias when it comes in the form of blatant comments, but less aware when it's in the form of, say, how the training is conducted, how our gears fit in the military, what's designed for us. And I remember one of my first experience in basic training was, and we had to low crawl under a wire, part of training, and they want us to go flat. And I'm thinking, how flat do you want me to go? I have a bulge in the front. I can't get us flat. And I remember the drill sergeant saying, get down, get down, get down. You need to hold your head. And my head is down. But of course, I'm not going to be flat like some of the males. And even, the training where you have to climb over things and, just different training activities that we have to do where the ladder is further away and most women, our legs are shorter, so even the way things are designed just in basic training. And then kind of fast forward to, I was at the McCord Lewis training base for a while, and I changed my MOS there, and I got a chance to get to DC area. And I remember when I got there, it was like in the plight of diversity. Let's get women in the front. Let's prop them up. And when I got to DC as a chaplain assistant, I was a chaplain assistant with Old Guard, and those are the fellas, mostly fellas who were the tomb of guard for the Tomb of the Unknown, where very few, you can count the amount of women all the years who were ever assigned to that duty, because your hips have to be the width of your shoulder. How many women have hips the width of their shoulder? So that's one thing. But I remember being there, and they needed someone to run the prayer breakfast at the Pentagon. And I remember it was myself, Sergeant Rodriguez, male type, and there was another female private, and she was a white female. And she said, I'm not going. There are too many brass up there. And they said, well, Taylor, you should probably go because they're probably going to pick you. So it made me feel like I was put in this place where I was a prop. They didn't really want me to be there. But now we're in the Obama administration. That was like, I think my second year being there. So now they need a Black girl to run the prayer breakfast because we need to show diversity. So it makes me start wondering, was I qualified? Or did you actually want me to be there? So it really messed with my cognitive thought and processing about myself. What do I need to do? And I needed to go to the promotion board during that time. And of course, those of us who serve more than a day in the military, the standards of training are very different from male versus female. Is it that they thought that we were weaker, we're not as strong enough? And it's not like there's a competition. The military is all competition. So I'm not asking for an advantage. No women, no minority in the military is asking for an advantage. We just want a fair ground. So I just remember just the beginning part of my military feeling like, where do I belong? And then I remember someone say to me, one of our chaplains says, well, at least you're not a Black American. You're Jamaican, so you're different. Up to this day, I still doesn't know what that, I'm trying to figure out, what does that mean? So where do I fit in? So it kind of led me to started looking at what I need to do to get to the next level. So I need to compete. And as a Black woman, as an immigrant in the military, and as a single mom in the military, a single parent, it left me with very little, almost reassurance. And I think I've had to work so much harder and recognize so much less for what I did. I scored 100 on my PT test. I was one of the fastest runner. I was able to do these things. And so I met the standard. And then I remember one of my, we had to do urinalysis and said, well, Taylor would be good. She's at the male standard. What does that mean? I'm at the male standard. I'm at the standard that you set in the military. So it's those are the things that kind of shape, how I see the military and realize that I'm competing against every single male, even the Black male, even the minority male. That's my competition. And then I remember there was a male soldier that was a single dad because mom was deployed, had totally different rules for him versus me. He was a single parent. I was a single parent, but he had different times when he got to leave. I had to work my full shift, and it was all these different things that make it such a common place of misfit for me. So it was, I think it wasn't until probably my maybe seventh or eighth year, probably that's after my third deployment, second or third deployment, maybe in between, I realized that I don't want to, I don't want to compete anymore. I am going to serve the way I serve. And one of the way I chose to do that in the chaplain school was I had to start empowering the other minorities to speak up, because our voice were so silent. It was crickets all the time. You complain about things, you say things, and it goes in deafening ears. So it doesn't matter. And I was really at a really good place. And up to this day, sometimes I remember thinking, I don't know if this is where I belong. I studied hard. I did my soft skills. I went to ANOC, BNOC at the time, all my leadership courses. I even took on an additional skill identifier. I went on the Air Force Base for 10 months to be a contracting specialist. And even that was a challenge, because as a chaplain assistant, we had 5 services that I had to make sure were run properly. In addition to, we had to do 40 funerals a week for burial. And I remember they said, Taylor, we need to contract chaplains. So the gospel chaplains. So I said, well, whoever put in a bid, we're going to pick the most qualified person. Well, why does it need to be a Black chaplain for the gospel service? Why does it need to be a white chaplain for the for the Protestant services or for the Catholic services? And it was such a challenge. And the challenge came from my superiors. So I wasn't even left to do what I knew how to do, what I was really good at. So it became a place of just misfit. A lot of my career, I had to try to figure out, what do I do? Where do I go? And towards the end of my enlistment, I was injured in Iraq and came home, and I was at Walter Reed, stayed there for about 18 months. And even there in the hospital, you saw the difference with who gets services, when do we get services, who gets visit, who gets to come in. So again, it was such a confusing time. I knew what I wanted, and I was very gung-ho about getting what I want, and I got where I needed to go with a lot of help from the outside, not within my MOS. And a lot of times it was from other females from other service. And thank God the military started merging with Army, Air Force, Army, Navy, Army, Marines. So we were merging. So I had a chance to start different programs. And another position I had was I was the EO specialist. So that gave me a chance to create different things to observe. But even then, personally, it was such a hard time to grow. You learn a lot, you did what you needed to do, but it was such a difficult time to grow for me.
Thank you so much, Juliet. I know that Pam has to hop off at around now, but I want to just ask a quick question that was asked in the queue that I think would give Pam the opportunity to briefly, talk about her work, which is from the Veterans Legal Services. And VLS, the question comes down to, if marginalized people, if folks that don't feel comfortable finding their legal services through VA, how can us as advocates best reach the populations that we would like to serve if we can't go through the routes of VA or different, American Legion or places that might not necessarily be as inclusive?
My quick answer is we should create more paid opportunities for military veterans to do outreach, especially underrepresented ones. Vets know where vets are. And I think that we need to go where those vets are going to go: school, community organizations, other workplaces, unions, right? So I think that we actually need to bring veterans into paid opportunities where they can go do that field work.
All right. Pam, I do know that you have to hop off, but thank you so much for joining us. And thank you so much for sharing your experience. But I would love to give Lindsay and Juliet the opportunity to answer that question. And we also have one more question if we have time for that too. So Lindsay, I'll turn it over to you. Where can we best reach the folks that most need an advocate in this space if we can't rely on VA or other traditional outreach means to access those folks?
Thank you for the question, and I think it's a two-part answer. So first and foremost, I always tell people that before you do any outreach or try to find people or bring people into community, you need to make sure that you're trained and educated in those communities. So I see a lot of times people are like, I want to reach more minority veterans. I want to reach more people of color. I want to reach more women. I want to reach more LGBTQ folks. And they ask some of the most inappropriate questions because they don't have a baseline understanding of the community that they're trying to serve. And so I think the very first thing before anybody does any outreach is to learn the communities that you're trying to recruit and bring into your programs, because that will give you a lot of the knowledge base that you need to know about where to find folks. Because when you do those trainings, you start to learn about where people landed instead of where they were supposed to land. So like, learning about LGBTQ vets, you're going to learn about marginalization, and you're going to learn about where they actually, like where we reside, because, you know, the conversation around VA and some of the traditional veteran organizations, that's not where they're going to reside, but you need to understand why. So that's first and foremost. And the second is building partnerships instead of like outreach partners. The thing about that we get a lot of is like, I need a person for my study, or I need a person for an article, and that's well and good. And I've never met you before. I don't know if I can trust you. I don't know if I want to send my community to you. So building trustful partnerships that are long lasting and not just about that one-off thing that I can do for you, but truly about how do we build together? Because that's the part that organizations like my own, I need to know that you're here for the long run. I'm not going to send you a person so you can turn them into a token. So that's the piece, is like, you need to build long range partnerships that are truly strategic in nature and that are mutually advantageous and beneficial. Because one of the number of people that come to me directly that are just looking to take but never do anything to enhance this community's ability to thrive, it's a lot. And so making sure that you actually are creating partnerships, that's where you're going to get those people, because you can't go to traditional means and expect that's where you're going to get people that you need to serve. You actually have to go meet them where they are and build long-range, trustful partnerships.
Yeah, meeting people where they're at is the most, I think, crucial advice that anybody who wants to do any level of organizing or advocacy work, but meeting people where they're at is so important. And Juliet, you have, and this is kind of a question that I wanted to ask you anyway, so this bleeds into this question really neatly. You have established leadership positions in Connecticut, VSO. You are with the Disabled American Veterans Organization. How do you think that we as advocates should reach out to the sectors of the veteran population that need our, resources the most?
Okay, similarly to what even Linda said, but what I believe would work best, especially in our area, is really collaboration and empowerment. So we have a few veterans who are already involved. Empower those veterans. It's almost like, I think Lindsay or maybe Pam said it, empower the harm. Let them know. So like, for instance, when I do like events, take event fishing, whatever, take event hunting, these are also male dominant events. What I do, because I just go in and create women, get a few women together and say, okay, let's get more women. So empowering these women to get more women, or empowering minorities to get more minorities, but definitely collaboration. So groups that are already out there, it's really good to go out and collaborate with them because they have an idea about the population that you're trying to reach. Because sometimes going to a new organization, you have to really go out and school them, let them know what terms, what to use, just educate them. So I think one of the fastest way that I find that work, especially with DAV, not even just with membership, because membership is not even my thing with DAV, is really getting out there and empower one person who can empower another person, who can empower another person. Let someone know where, how did you get your benefits? Okay, go tell someone else. But it's kind of like it's almost like teasing it out, because they've been so harmed and so down for so long that by the time they get to where they feel comfortable navigating the system, they're so exhausted. So it's really just getting back to them again, gently, getting back. But it's definitely empowering groups that are out there to go out, empowering the harm, and definitely peer, creating positions for peer in organization,
Yeah. So thank you so much. I think, and I know that Pam had to step off, but I think you've all given us such insight into this important topic and ways that we can kind of take up this issue and get involved. We are out of time, but I will say, oh, we have one more question. Oh, I'm so sorry. Hold on. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah.
So we have a question from Des Diorio from WSHU Public Radio and the American Home Project, who say thank you for serving, Pam, Juliet, and Lindsay. They're interested in how your actual military experience differed or not from your expectation going in, which is a super interesting question. So let's start with Juliet. How did your expectation of the service differ from the reality of when you enlisted?
Well, first of all, I still see my recruiter every now and then. And I said, you're a liar, because, I thought I was going to go to school. I'm going to go to college. I'm going to get all this stuff. I'm going to, trying to sync things. And it's very, very different. The reality is that's the poster board, that's the billboard that you see, that you kind of think about. But then it's more when you get in, you have to navigate, learn, work. The space is so limited. And the resources is so vast. You don't know where to go and no one to really direct you. Then you have to deal with all these different opposition and all these different oppression. It's very, very different, but it really takes a commander or someone who's really willing and ready to lead you, to help you navigate and find your path. But it's really, for me, was night and day.
And I'll answer. So I'm from a military family. I was the fifth of six in my family to serve. My mom served, my grandfather, my uncle, my other uncle, my cousin's still in. So we came from a long line of military service among all of us. We didn't talk a lot about service because I think my family, even though we are so heavily military, was also a part of what we all call the poverty draft. Pam alluded to, the school to military pipeline, and, people living in poverty and lower socioeconomic status. That's where we gain equity. It's the largest equity generator in our lifetime. And so my family didn't really talk about it much. My mom hasn't just recently started talking to me about her service more. As a woman that served from 1978 to 88, things were not kind for her. Her first night that she was she was taken to boot camp, because they used to actually have your recruiter take you to boot camp. He tried to rape her. So she didn't talk about her service. Like, she still hasn't told me all of the things about her service that were informed by her gender identity. And so she didn't talk about it a lot until after I was out of the service. And so I don't know quite what I was expecting, but I was part of that post 9/11 generation that really, like, I've definitely unpacked this a lot more since I got out of the service, but like, we were recruited with a very specific message that, like, your country needs you. And,
Right.
9/11 was a thing, and it's very prescient in your mind. And like, you have a duty and an obligation. I literally signed on the dotted line after 9/11, put myself back in a closet so that I could serve my country, because I felt like my country needed me. And so what I got was an institution that sits on your shoulders at all times of the day. What I wasn't expecting was, I knew the military was going to be hard. Like, none of us are under any impression that this is going to be an easy journey. What I didn't expect was, like, that if you mess up, your entire life is ruined. Like, that's the thing about military service that they don't really tell you, is that the whole entirety of the system is designed for you to live insular to the military community. The justice system, your food, where your housing is, all of it is built into one system. If you experience harm or trauma, like my first, when I was in boot camp, I was brought into an office by a fleet master chief that told me if I came to boot camp to find somebody to get into racks with, I came to the wrong place. And I was almost pushed out of the military for this. And I was standing in a room with zero power to do anything about this hateful comment. And honestly, living under don't ask, don't tell, I expected that if I didn't tell, they weren't going to ask. That wasn't the reality. A number of people were asked, and the only people that ever got in trouble were the people that told, or they didn't even tell but were found out. So there was very much like an inconsistency between what they said and what they did. You know, like don't ask, don't tell is a really good example of that. They said don't ask, don't tell. So I said, I'm not okay. All right, fine. I can keep my personal life in my personal life. What they didn't tell me was that they were like, it was supposed to be don't ask, don't tell, don't pursue, but they pursued all the time. You know, like those were the realities of the situation, that if you misstep, it's not just like you lose your job, because like it's not great to lose to be unemployed, but when you lose your job in the military and they push you out, it ruins your life. It ruins your livelihood. You carry that other than honorable, that dishonorable, that don't ask, don't tell discharge with you for your entirety of your life. Like there were instances where I was never assaulted, but I was coerced into staying in a relationship with somebody because she threatened to tell my leadership that we had slept together. I stayed with this person because I was afraid that if I did have something different, that I was going to be found out and kicked out of the military. Like that was my secret that I had to hold, and I had to do things to maintain that secrecy that I'm not okay with. Like I've never been okay with, but that was a part of what we had to do to get by. And so I don't think that anybody expects that military service is going to destroy your mental health. Like it's one thing to like wreck your body, because like that stuff is really hard. And it's a whole other thing to wreck your entire life. Like there are so many veterans now that still carry those historic traumas and those scars that will never go away no matter how much time passes. The best we can hope for is that it scars over enough that we can continue on with our lives.
Yeah, and I think that what you said, Lindsay, is a perfect segue into Cvlc's call to action, which is, other than honorable discharges do ruin people's lives. And a lot of folks who do get kicked out of the service, like Lindsay said and Pam alluded to also, and Juliet's experience in just being othered, people with trauma act out and have misconduct because they act out, because they don't have the supportive services. And having an OTH discharge literally bars you from VA healthcare, the very thing that can help you. So in exciting news, VA wants to hear what you think about that. Comments are open, and VA is considering this groundbreaking move in reforming the regulatory bars to VA healthcare and VA benefits. It's a comment about the Federal Register 3.12, and the Connecticut Veterans Legal Center has put together a response to information on this comment, begging VA to remove the regulatory bars and to give people the opportunity to access this life-saving health care. And there have been a lot of questions and a lot of these themes about how VA is not inclusive and VA does not have their doors open. Now is the opportunity where we can tell them that they have to open the door. So I'm going to plop a blurb in the chat where folks can read our comment. And if you would like to sign on to our comments, you can shoot an email to the primary author of our comment, Attorney Alden Pinkham, by October 11th by 5 p.m. because it is due on October 12th. And we're really urging people to take this opportunity to push VA to do the right thing here. So I'm going to pop that blurb into our chat. We're going to see if we can do it correctly. But this is the blurb, and then you can read our comments right here at this link. So I really encourage people to do that. I really encourage folks to check out Vets for the People and Minority Vets. They are doing such amazing, groundbreaking work in terms of inclusivity in the service and in VA. I want to personally thank all of our panelists, Pam, who had to step off, for just really opening our eyes to these incredible and devastating incidents that happened in the service. Thank you so much, Lindsay and Juliet, for sharing your personal and professional experiences in the service. And we hope that, you know, the folks that watch this learn something. I know that I certainly did, and continue to stay involved and active with these communities, because folks really, really need help. And we're here to provide that for them in the best way that we can. So thank you all so much. Again, really encourage you to reach out to those resources. And thank you all so much for attending this panel and webinar on gender in the military.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Bye-bye.